specialist here at the Religious Freedom Center of the Freedom Forum Institute. For those of you who may not be aware, the Religious Freedom Center is a nonpartisan, non-sectarian organization dedicated to educating the public about the history, meaning, and significance of the religious liberty clauses of the First Amendment. And we're proud to be part of the Freedom Forum Institute family, which is dedicated to educating about all 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. We are here today to talk about a groundbreaking new book called Teaching About Religion in the Social Studies Classroom that was published by the National Council for the Social Studies and edited by the founding director of the Religious Freedom Center, Charles Haynes. We have a very distinguished panel here today to talk about the book. Some of them are authors in the book. Some of them have been involved in religion and education more broadly, either in assessing the efficacy of religious studies education or in teaching about religion in our public schools. So we're really, really pleased to have them, both public school and independent school perspectives, and perspectives of those who are working on religion and education. And it's my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Lawrence Pasca, Larry Pasca. He's the executive director of the National Council for the Social Studies, and his appointment began in October 2016. Dr. Pasca began his career as a middle school social studies teacher in New York State public school districts, and he later served in multiple roles at the New York State Education Department, including in Albany, New York. He led New York Standards and Assessment Program for pre through 12 social studies education as a state social studies specialist, and established the Office of Educational Design and Technology in P-12 education, and implemented the Board of Regents statewide learning technology plan and regulations for online and blended learning. He returned to schools as the Director of Social Studies for the Harrison Central School District in New York, leading K-12 social studies, and served as the Director of Professional Development for the Southern Westchester Board of Cooperative Educational Services. I could go on and on about Dr. Pasca's commitment and lifetime of service to public school education, and we're really pleased to have had the opportunity to work with Dr. Pasca in the last few years as he's been the Executive Director and raising the profile of religious studies education in public and independent schools across the country. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Pasca. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our conversation this afternoon on religious literacy in public schools and to celebrate the recent publication of our book, Teaching About Religion in the Social Studies Classroom. Why is today's conversation important to educators nationwide? First, we share a vision that all students are educated and inspired for lifelong inquiry and informed civic action. We know that to achieve this vision, our instructional programs must be based on multiple disciplines working together. And that's where social studies comes in. Within the school curriculum, social studies learning depends on multiple disciplines like religious studies to help young people develop the ability to make informed and reasoned decisions for the public good as citizens of a culturally diverse, democratic society in an interdependent world. So in 2013, we published the College, Career, and Civic Life, or C3 framework for social studies state standards, and this was a partnership with 14 other professional associations. The C3 framework is intended to guide states and districts in revising their standards and instructional programs toward inquiry learning. In 2017, we received a religious studies companion document to the C3 framework that was supported by the Religious Freedom Center, the American Academy of Religion, and many educators, many classroom teachers who contributed to it from across the country. This document described the vital role of inquiry in religious studies as a social studies discipline. So we quickly approved and published this document in our second edition of the C3 framework. That year, we also established a religious studies special interest community for our members so that the subject of religious studies could be more fully discussed among our wider social studies community. Last year, we were proud to co-host a Religious Studies Summer Institute here at the museum with the Religious Freedom Center. We brought educators from multiple subject areas to discuss strategies and resources for implementing a religious studies program in their local curriculum. In short, teaching about religion is an important part of teaching social studies. As the largest association in the country devoted to social studies education, we're looking at this as a vital moment in American education. And we renew our commitment to ensure that all social studies disciplines are supported to ensure a well-rounded education for our learners. As we noted in today's program invitation, the study of religion is essential for understanding the past and present, critical for global citizenship in a religiously diverse country and world. Our book, today's panel, and our larger work together over the past 2 years are all firm commitments to provide leadership, services, and support to help educators know what to teach about religion and how to do it. We hope this conversation today, our book, and our partnership together supports all educators, both within and beyond the social studies. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our panel. Our panel moderator is Dr. Charles C. Haynes. He is the founding director of the Religious Freedom Center. He writes and speaks extensively on religious liberty and religion in American public life. Haynes is best known for his work on First Amendment issues in public schools. Over the past 2 decades, he has been the principal organizer and drafter of consensus guidelines on religious liberty in schools, endorsed by a broad range of religious and educational organizations. In January 2000, 3 of the guides were distributed by the U.S. Department of Education to every public school in the nation. Haynes is the co-author or author of 6 books, including First Freedoms, a documentary history of First Amendment rights in America, and Religion in American Public Life, Living with Our Deepest Differences. His column, Inside the First Amendment, appears in newspapers nationwide. Kristen Farrington is the assistant chaplain at St. Stephen's and St. Agnes School. She is the former executive director of the Religious Freedom Center of the Freedom Forum Institute, which is located in the museum. As executive director, Kristen worked to fulfill the mission of the nonpartisan center, which is twofold: to educate the public about the history, meaning, and significance of religious freedom, and to promote dialogue and understanding among people of all religions and none. Before joining the Religious Freedom Center in 2016, Kristen was the head of programs and partnership for the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change in the United States. And for the past 13 years, Kristen has been involved in education as a teacher, administrator, trainer, and consultant. Dr. Donna Phillips is the DC Public Schools Social Studies Curriculum Manager, where she oversees the development of K-12 social studies curriculum, coaches social studies teaching fellows, and works with the social studies team to align curriculum with assessments and professional development. In her role, she develops inquiry units using the C3 framework. Over her 20-plus years in education, Dr. Phillips has partnered with institutions such as the Center for Civic Education, iCivics, C3 Teachers, Museum, the Religious Freedom Center, and many more. She was the 2007 American Civic Education Teacher of the Year. Dr. Emil Lester is professor at the University of Mary Washington. Professor Lester's book, Teaching Religions, A Democratic Approach for Public Schools, is published by the University of Michigan Press. He's the recipient of substantial research grants from the Religious Freedom Center at the museum for his 2017 to 2019 evaluation of the Georgia 3 R's Project. The Religious Freedom Center selected Professor Lester as the official evaluator of this important initiative to encourage religious literacy and respect for religious freedom in Georgia's and the nation's public schools. By the project's conclusion, Professor Lester and his research associates will have interviewed approximately 100 religious, civic, and educational communities from a diverse array of religious, national, and racial groups in various parts of Georgia. Susan Douglas is an educational consultant at the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. She received her PhD in history from George Mason University in 2016 and holds an MA in Arab Studies from the Georgetown University Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and a BA in history from the University of Rochester. During 2006, she served as a senior researcher for the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations Initiative and served as an affiliated scholar with the Council on Islamic Education for a decade, reviewing more than a dozen commercial textbooks in development, reviewing state curricula and standards, and developing instructional resources. And Ben Marcus is the religious literacy specialist with the Religious Freedom Center at the Freedom Forum Institute, where he examines the intersection of education, religious literacy, and identity formation in the United States. In February 2018, he was accepted as a Fulbright specialist for a period of 3 years. And as a specialist, he will share his expertise on religion and education with select host institutions abroad. Marcus chaired the writing group for the Religious Studies Companion Document to the C3 Framework, a nationally recognized set of guidelines that are used by state and school district curriculum experts. He is also a contributing author in the Oxford Handbook on Religion and American Education, where he writes about the importance of religious literacy instruction. In 2015, he also served as executive editor of the white paper of the Subworking Group on Religion and Conflict Mitigation of the State Department's Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel today, and thank Dr. Haynes for moderating our panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Larry. I was asked to give a little historical context, so I'm going to do that before we start the panel. It may be more than you want to know, but I think it is important to know how we got here today before we begin our conversation, or at least a little bit of how we got here today. And I also want to, it hasn't been done yet, so I'll do it, welcome our our virtual listeners, viewers, wherever you may be. It's a wonderful thing that we're able to do that now. And people anywhere can tune in, can hear the program. It's so welcome to you all, and thank you for tuning in. And thank you for being here. I want to thank the National Council for the Social Studies. I've been a lifelong part of the social studies world, including NCSS, and they do such incredibly important work. I particularly am grateful to Larry Pasca for his leadership and on these issues, but on many others, as you have heard, and to the editor of Social Education who's sitting back there, Michael Simpson. Michael was tenacious about this project. It started out, it was going to be an issue of social education, and then it kind of grew and grew and became a book. But it was his vision and his persistence and his hard work that brought it about. And I think it's going to be a book that will last for many years as an important resource. So thank you, Michael. My strong conviction is that getting religious liberty and religious literacy right in public education is critical to the future of the American experiment in democracy. Religious liberty and religious literacy are, in my view, inseparable, right? They're interdependent. Religious liberty under the First Amendment provides a legal and civic framework for Americans to learn about one another in our public schools. And religious literacy, in turn, upholds the First Amendment by helping to promote understanding and respect across even our deepest differences. So I don't think you can have one without the other in a country dedicated to religious liberty for all. To encourage religious liberty and religious literacy in public schools and in private schools, independent schools, religious schools, but the First Amendment, I think, speaks directly to what we do in public schools, but the spirit of the First Amendment speaks to how we are educating people in all of our schools. So it's really all schools. The Religious Freedom Center works to help local school districts find common ground on First Amendment issues and prepare teachers to teach about religion in ways that are constitutionally and academically sound. On a national level, we've joined with NCSS and many others to develop consensus guidelines. There are a total of 10 of those to date. And that's very important because without those consensus guidelines, we don't have a safe harbor for schools to do this work. The religious liberty principles of the First Amendment are really what John Courtney Murray used to call our articles of peace. They're not our articles of faith. We have those in our different ways, and they're very important to us. But they are our articles of peace because those rights and responsibilities that flow from the First Amendment are what enable us to understand one another, to negotiate our differences, and where possible to even find common ground across our differences. Unfortunately, and this is the historical part that you probably know, but bears repeating, our difficult history in the United States of getting religion wrong in public schools has created widespread confusion and controversy concerning the constitutional role of religion in schools, especially in the curriculum. So when I first began working on these issues in the 1980s, many schools that I would visit, people I'd talk to, those were religion-free zones, pretty much. Places where religion was completely excluded in the name of confusion over the Supreme Court rulings or a distorted view of separation of church and state. And then there were other schools that I would visit, especially in my home area of the South, that continued to promote one religion over others, clinging to vestiges of a bygone era, sort of holding on to that. Well, both of these approaches to religion and public education were then and are now unconstitutional and unjust. But today, more than 30 years later, growing numbers of public school educators are trying to get religious liberty and religious literacy right. As a result, there is more study about religions and more student religious expression in public schools today than at any time in many decades, perhaps in 100 years. Not widely seen or understood, but it's true. So religion is coming into public schools today, but now it's mostly through the First Amendment door, which is how it should be. Now, many factors have contributed to this sea change in education, including court decisions, litigation, the work of advocacy groups on all sides of these issues, but I'm going to only highlight the one development that we have been most involved in, and that's the consensus guidelines developed over the last 3 decades that Larry mentioned. This took broad coalitions of people, religious groups, civil liberties groups, education organizations, to come together and to find common ground for the first time in American history on how you deal with religion in a public school. And after fighting over this for 150 years, it was an extraordinary thing to finally say and issue a statement that the Christian Legal Society, the National Association of Evangelicals, and People for the American Way, and the various education groups, the American Jewish Committee, Islamic Society of North America, could all sign and say, yes, that's how it should be done. And we didn't do it just to have a statement, and issue a statement. We did it because we wanted to help the teacher in the classroom and the principal in the school have a safe harbor for doing the right thing without worrying about whether people on the right or the left were going to sue or fight. Now, it didn't solve all the issues to have these consensus guidelines, but believe me, it changed the landscape over time. If you go around the country today in many school districts and you read the policies that they have on religion in schools, and a lot of districts still don't have those policies, so they should, but when you read the ones that are in place, they often quote these guidelines. They lift them right out. Why? Because they know they're supported by the left and the right. Such guidelines as a teacher's guide to religion in public schools that Secretary of Education at the time, Dick Riley, asked me to put together so he and President Clinton could send it to all the schools in America. And they did. Send it to every single public school in America. It was a big step that the government was saying, yes, we can do this. The Bible in public schools, a guide that addressed perhaps the most contentious issue we've had in the curriculum over religion in our history. How do you do that? And we got People for the American Way who litigated against Christian Legal Society on that issue to come and agree on guidelines for how you do that properly in a public school. So America still works, right? If we do it, if we sit together, if we listen to one another, and if we try to craft areas where under the First Amendment we can agree. It doesn't always have to be a lawsuit, right? Or a fight, or a shouting match. So that's good news for public education and for our country. So as a result of this constitutional safe harbor I'm trying to describe here, we are beginning to get religious liberty and religious literacy right in many places. And when schools implement this new consensus, almost not so new anymore, but still in the context of our history, a new consensus, we can create, and we are creating, what I call First Amendment schools, right? Schools that actually are places that neither inculcate nor inhibit religion, but protect the First Amendment rights of students and include study about religion, the very important word about religion, where appropriate, in the curriculum. So thanks in large measure to this new consensus, study about religion in public schools has come a very long way since the late 1980s. State social studies standards, for example, and I'm going to ask some of our panelists to talk about this, are today fairly generous to religion, in stark contrast to the virtual silence in social studies frameworks when I started working on this some 30 years ago. You're hard-pressed to find mention of religion. And the history textbooks are better. They're not where I think they should be, of course, but I think they're better. Now, I'm just going to say one negative thing here, just so that we don't say this is all great and going in the right direction. I think in spite of the progress, in spite of the good faith effort in many schools, I think we still fall short in public education, my view, of serious treatment of religion or serious study of religion in public schools. I think far too often we think mentioning religion more often is we've done religion, or sticking it more references in textbooks and now we're there. And of course that's not what we mean by religious studies that really helps students understand the world and helps them understand their neighbor and so forth. That has to be much more substantive. There are places that are doing that, but we're still working at that. And I would argue that under the First Amendment and the call under the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment for neutrality by public schools among religions and between religion and non-religion, that's the First Amendment vision, to leave religion out completely, ignore it, or marginalize it is hardly neutral. Right? If I ignored you, you wanted to ask something and I just ignored you, you wouldn't think, oh, I'm being neutral. You think I'm being hostile. And so a lot of Americans, particularly many religious Americans, began to think public schools were hostile to their religion because they weren't there. So we are learning that inclusion of the various voices and learning about them in a way that's constitutionally appropriate is also living up to our First Amendment vision of fairness under the First Amendment. Fairness. Now, to get where I hope we will go, serious treatment about religion in the public schools, we're going to have to do a lot to reform how teachers are prepared, and I want to ask the panel to talk about that. And we're going to have to make sure that what NCSS is leading the way in the C3 framework that Larry mentioned is actually implemented in schools. So we have a lot of work to do. This book is a milestone. Not because a book can solve all the problems, but because it is symbolic of how far we've come, that we can put out a handbook that I think is like the roadmap for how you do this and points you to other resources you can use if you're a teacher in a classroom. It's a great step towards saying this is what we should be doing in every school and in every community. And if schools and communities take this opportunity that this new consensus offers, we can turn them into First Amendment schools. Places where we prepare citizens to live with even our deepest differences and forge one nation of many peoples, many faiths in the 21st century. Thank you very much. Now I'll put on my moderator hat and get to the wonderful panel we have. We could not have a better panel. We have people who've been working at this a very long time. So I thought one way to do this would be to start with a little bit of where we are and how we got here in terms of textbooks and standards and state frameworks, because that's what people teach. If it isn't in the textbook, it's not likely to be taught, and as we found out in the 80s. So I suggested that we moved a long way, and I want to ask Susan Douglas to tell us a little bit about her perspective on how we've moved a long way, because I don't know anyone who's read more textbooks, poor Susan, than Susan, and reviewed them and looked for how they're treating religion over the years and published a study of state frameworks and how they treat religion. So Susan, tell us a little bit about this movement that you've seen over your career on this issue.
Thank you very much, and very pleased to be here. And thank you to Michael Simpson for your stick-to-itiveness on the book. He was hard on us. He was hard on us, but for good reason. My work with the First Amendment Center and with Charles Haynes goes back, believe it or not, to the late 1980s, when we happened upon one another through my writing and his work. And at that time, to sort of characterize textbooks that were out there, and I have to preface this by saying that teaching about the world is the context within which world religions takes place, and religion in American life within U.S. history textbooks. My major concern has been with teaching about the world in world history and world geography textbooks, where no one religion is taught in isolation, and gradually there has been a movement toward more content. When I began this work and looking at textbooks to review them for use in the classroom and then for adherence to the standards and towards improvement, to the guidelines rather, for teaching about religion, what you had was, well, let me just start with when I grew up. There was like practically no mention anywhere, and if you were lucky, you might have heard the word Islam, or if you were unlucky, in talking about the Crusades, and it would be just a tossed-off sentence. By the time I began working on textbooks seriously in the 1980s, toward using them in the classroom myself as a world history teacher, and toward working with the publishers later on into the 90s, there was maybe, the 2-column format in those textbooks, heavy text, and there would be mention of religions within the context of an empire usually, and then this sort would trail off. And it was maybe a paragraph or so or something under achievements. Each religion was identified with a civilization and sort of closed off with that, because that was the building block, and still to some degree is the building block of teaching about world religions. By the time you had another decade or so go by, and I linked this directly with the promulgation of the guidelines for teaching about religion, and particularly for the work that Charles Haynes did, say, in Georgia and in California, which set up a curriculum of what's called draped history, where you don't try and fail to get through all of world history twice or 3 times in the curriculum, but actually chronologically break it up across several courses, assuming that students will remember something, especially if they haven't raced through it like mad. So what happened there was that there was now some more space, not just to consider a religion as a part of some civilization story, but the religions on their own. And so from a bare mention in one of those heavy columns of text to a subsection in a chapter to actually having entire chapters on each world religion was what happened. When in the mid-1990s, the national standards were published pretty much across the country, and then each state went on to build its own set of standards, conforming to one of several models, as I was privileged to do a study here for the First Amendment Center on all those standards, with inspiration from Warren Nord, who introduced the idea of teaching seriously about religion in the curriculum. I said, okay, that's where the rubber hits the road in what the standards say, because that is what textbook publishers will look at when they're wanting to be adopted. That's what the states look at and the districts look at when they build their curriculum. So what then began to take place was to have these kind of chapters and units on each world religion, and they more or less conform to the guidelines, not now to what the AAR has brought out and what the C3 Framework Supplement brought in with the expertise of religious studies experts, which call for differentiation, dynamic coverage, change over time. Rather, they were sort of static, and the most difficult ones were where they would simply say, okay, each religion is assumed to have a founder and an origin and a story that could be put up on one of these grids, and each one was assumed to have some sort of writings or scripture. These cookie-cutter ways were very difficult for teachers to teach. They were not accurate. They, actually violate the very beliefs and practices of several of the world religions. So as these things started to improve, publishers during the 1990s really took interest in paying attention. I did reviews of probably 20 or 30 textbooks. And there was a great readiness when you would tell the editors in reviewing a manuscript that this does not meet the guidelines for teaching about religion, either because of accuracy or because of its most particularly seeming to make truth claims. Because the most amazing thing about this set of guidelines is not just the words of it, but the implications of it that allow us to educate students in a very authentic way. That's the aspiration, to be authentic, not sort of the Orientalist view that looks at these religions from afar or through a lens of a known religion, in Western European history or Western civilization's history, but rather to portray beliefs and practices as their adherents understand them. At the same time, however, not making truth claims directly, so that when we would critique what a publisher had written, it might say, well, using the example of Islam, Muhammad had a vision in a cave, or he received revelation through the angel Gabriel. That is what people believe, and therefore it's very authentic, but it is also a truth claim unless it is prefaced with an attribution to a source, so that it then becomes a history of a story told. It becomes an attributed thing, but at the same, you see, it's a big difference. It's like the difference between teaching religion and teaching about religion. And so this is the model that we follow, that we encourage the textbooks to follow, that we encourage teachers to follow. And so in the classroom, under standards regimes, which often do in fact take on a sort of cookie cutter appearance, it'll say, some of the standards out there actually say things like, these are from the 90s and they're still persistent, even though the emphasis on skills in the Common Core has taken away the emphasis on content to some degree. But they will say, students will be able to describe the origins, beliefs, major figures, and history of these faiths, beliefs, practices, and so on. And then it'll name the 5 major faiths, just one after the other. So again, you have this sort of potential putting things up on a graphic organizer that doesn't fit. A lot of the worst errors have come out of the textbooks through the review process. And so upside down images, sensitivity to images that violate the standards of teaching about religion within those faiths. Really, we have come a very long way. And particularly, and I'll wrap up here, with the promulgation of the national standards for history, we had a very, very differentiated way of embedding teaching about world religions, each for its own systems, each for its own unique history and characteristics, that provides an actual teaching document for curriculum developers and for teachers in the classroom. So we're at a point where some of that has fallen down the American education memory hole, but I think this book particularly revives it because it doesn't just put in a cookie cutter presentation of each religion, but really has allowed the authors to go forward and differentiate and give a guideline, a roadmap for teaching about each of the faiths as a unique, authentic, and differentiated dynamic phenomenon in world history. So.
Well, thank you, Susan, and you have done such great work over the years on these issues. No one has done more to call attention to the need to address this in textbooks than you. Thank you, and frameworks. Donna, I'm going to turn to you because we need a little on-the-ground word here. We were talking about the changes, the textbooks, the frameworks, but how are teachers dealing with all this over time? And in your experience, because I know you've been in the classroom and now you work with many, many teachers, what is your experience of how they are dealing with this? You can say how it has been in your career and then now, or however you want to address it, but what is the teacher experience?
I think one of the biggest challenges in the classroom persistently, and it was certainly for me at my time in the classroom, is approaching religion as a comparison as others. You start with the most common religion, Christianity, and everything becomes a comparison back to that. And you have the graphic organizer, and then you also have, these are just the stories we're going to hold on to, and now we've done it, now we're going to move on. And so to combat that, I think one of the biggest change makers has been the C3 framework and the orientation of all of social studies to an inquiry approach. And when you can ask a question and then say, how does Christianity answer this question? How does Buddhism answer this question? then you have to get into the nuances of each religion, and you're not relegated to a graphic organizer. And so the challenges are vast. So in my role right now, we write curriculum. One of the biggest advantages that DC has is Ben Marcus and Susan Douglas, and we in a small district where we actually know, and in fact, one of our teachers is right here in the audience. We actually know our teachers, our social studies teachers in particular. And so we get questions all the time. We see classrooms all the time, and we can say, hey, we saw this approach. What do you think about this? Or we're working on this curricular unit. We want to use certain texts. Can you help us make sure that we get it right? And so with the C3 framework at the beginning, even before we had the religious studies standards, we were able to work collaboratively with our partners across the district to make sure that we are providing resources and guidance for teachers. Now, having said that, every teacher is going to approach it differently. And so one of the biggest aspects to the success of teaching about religion, I think, is the professional development and support for the teachers themselves, and making sure that they are getting what they need to have the comfort level to talk and to teach constitutionally and academically correct about religion. With that professional development, I think one of the biggest change makers for teachers, and for me for sure, is actually listening to and hearing from religious leaders themselves. And I'm thinking about one particular standard that's part of the C3 Religious Studies Companion, which is about the internal diversity of each religion, and making sure that even as young as third grade in elementary, students understand that there are so many differences even within each religion that you're learning about, because we tend to just kind of gloss over things and go for the big comparisons. And so just hearing from different speakers as a professional and then being able to take that perspective back into the classroom, that goes a long way. But the other side of that, though, is that just as it's reflected in one of the chapters in the book, there is always pushback from parents. We don't mandate that teachers bring guest speakers in. We don't mandate that they take students to religious sites. We recommend reaching out to different resources, and we give them guidance for making those decisions. And so as a district, we also have to address parent pushback and student, and most of the times it's the parents. It's not necessarily the students who have been upset by what has happened in terms of teaching religion. But a teacher making the decision to do that, or even bringing the guest speaker in, I was heartened by the one essay, even within bringing in that guest speaker or making that visit, the teacher still has an immense responsibility to continue to ask the questions. Well, this is what we saw here. This is what this leader said was their experience. How does that measure against what we know about other types, other nuances within the practice of that religion? This is just one experience, one example, and making sure that students understand that any one thing does not speak for all of that religion. And I mean, that's the kind of thing that we want adults to carry, we want our kids to carry outside into the world. That's what opens us up to understanding everyone else in the world, and keeps that orientation towards truly understanding and building a good society.
Thank you so much, Donna, and for bringing that teacher experience voice, and we'll hope get more, because I know we have a couple of teachers in the room, including Chris Murray over there, who's a wonderful world religions teacher who has a chapter in the book. Emil, I want to turn to you next, because you have actually studied the impact of learning about religions on student attitudes, which is pretty important, and I think it's still the only such study out there. So thank you for being sort of the groundbreaker on that. Also, you have looked very carefully at textbooks yourself, and you have written about that there are often conflicts about how textbooks deal with religion. So it's not as though somehow they do it and it's all over. There are fights in different parts of the country, different approaches. So I don't know, there's a cluster of issues that you've dealt with in your research and your And now you're evaluating the Georgia 3Rs project. So we can't do all of that in one answer. We'll maybe spin some of these out along the way, but at least on the issue of how all of this that Don is talking about with teachers then affects the student. Maybe we should start with that, because you're the one that has looked at that.
So I like to think of myself as Charles's research guy. So Charles does this incredible amount of work on the ground, and then I come in afterwards and talk to a couple of people. So, I used to watch a lot of Bob the Builder with my young sons. And, Bob the Builder, they always ask, can we build it? And so Charles would do this work and come and say, did we build it? And, Bob the Builder's friends would always say, yes, we can, right? Which was later stolen by the Obama administration. What I would say to Charles, or I said in a couple of cases, and also to the Religious Freedom Center, is yes, you did. So the first such case was in Modesto, California, which has, I think, the only required world religions course in a public school in the country at the high school level. Charles, is this accurate? Have you heard?
It's still true. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, if Charles hasn't heard of it, then it doesn't exist. And we surveyed students. We surveyed 400 students on several different occasions, and we found some very encouraging things about these, about the effect of teaching about religion. First of all, perhaps not terribly surprisingly, students emerged from these courses much more religiously literate than they previously were before taking these courses. Perhaps even more encouraging, and particularly in this environment, students emerged from these courses more respectful of religious liberty. So students became better citizens. And there was something which we actually didn't expect to find, which was particularly encouraging. We asked students whether they would provide crucial rights and liberties to their least liked group. And what we found is that after taking this course, students were more likely to apply these liberties to their least liked groups. So I think what we can say is that students emerge from these courses as not only more well-educated, which is certainly a fundamental role of the public schools, but also as better citizens. The other thing which we studied out in Modesto and later is we took a look at community support for these programs. For those of you who are not familiar with Modesto, California, it's about 90 miles to the east of San Francisco, but the cultural universe is completely different. A lot of folks in that area describe it as belonging to the California Bible Belt. So we went and we talked to religious and civic leaders, evangelical Christians who are quite prominent in the area, California Bible Belt, members of non-Christian religious minorities, secularists, atheists. All of them believed that this course was a good idea. So there's this profound consensus for teaching about religions, which is relatively rare. I think I did an okay enough job in looking at what happened in Modesto that I was sent to Georgia. Which, as a New York Jew, I had a little bit of trepidation going down there so many times, but I got over it. And we're doing something similar in looking at the effects on the community in Georgia as well. So again, we've been to all over Georgia, fair amount in the Atlanta area, but also to rural small town Georgia as well, different parts of the state. We've spoken to religious leaders, civic leaders, educators, religious leaders from all sorts of different backgrounds. And again, we came away with this relatively shocking thing in this political environment that, evangelical Christians who we talked to thought that this was a good idea. Atheists thought that this was a good idea. For some reason, Atlanta seems to be the headquarters of certain prominent atheists, a former president for American Atheists. There's a very interesting lady we spoke to who's founded this group, Black Nonbelievers, and they're currently on the advisory council. So let me just talk about that really quickly. The Religious Freedom Center did this, and the Georgia 3Rs Project did this amazing job of putting together an advisory council, which really brings together the spectrum of religious representatives from Georgia. So I think one of the things which is encouraging in the connection to the book is that a lot of these principles and ideas and practices which are talked about in the book, these are not only successful educational practices, but these can also have a profound civic effect, and they can be the source of civic consensus as well.
Emil, just a little follow-up, because it's one of my favorite findings from your Modesto study. How did learning about religions affect students in terms of their own religious conviction? Because a lot of the concern of parents, I think, particularly religious parents, is, well, if they learn about all these religions, will it weaken their faith, or will they want to change to something else? And so you looked at that, and I thought that was a fascinating part of your study. And what happened?
Yeah, so we looked, we surveyed students about that out in California. We spoke to students in interviews about whether, considering other religions might encourage them to think about switching their religion or changing their religion. And what we found is that actually, in more cases, students were further confirmed in their faith than they were previously. That is, they found that through studying about other religions, they realized what was distinctive and special about their own faith. And of course, and just anecdotally, when we talked to evangelical leaders out in California, and also the some evangelical leaders we spoke to in Georgia as well, believed that this course would be helpful in solidifying the faith of students, giving them a greater understanding and literacy about their own faith.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. That's really helpful. Without research, you don't really know whether you're having any impact. So that's why the work that Emil Lester is doing is critical for the future of our work. So Ben, I'm going to turn to you. There's so many, again, expert things that you do. But I think maybe I'll start with talking about this important step with the C3, including religious studies in the C3 document, which people may, that might not mean much when you first hear it. But why is that, in your view, such a big step forward, and how did it work? You chaired the group that did that. And I'll just say that in the social studies world, which I've been in for a very long time, getting religious studies to be taken seriously in that world has not always been easy, right? It's like, well, we have history and we have economics, and so this is quite a statement to say this is a core competency for the social studies. So how did that process work? Did you get pushback? Who did you bring to the table? Anything you want to say about it? It's a big achievement.
So I attribute the success of the project to the fact that it started with teachers. So in 2016, outside Chicago, Illinois, there is this hub, for some reason, of people who are really committed to teaching about religion and doing it well. So I'm actually from that area. Full disclosure, I went to the district where we had this mini conference, but I was in one of the schools where I didn't learn about religion. And it was only after graduating that I learned that another school in the district, Prospect High School, had a teacher named John Camardella, who, in my view, is one of the best teachers in the country teaching about religion right now. So John and I and another colleague, Seth Brady, hosted a mini conference with some support from an organization called Interfaith Youth Corps to bring together people in the area to talk about what it means to teach about religion, what's going well in the area, and what could be done better. And toward the end of our conference, there was a teacher named Melissa who stood up and said, this is all well and fine. We're really glad to hear that you're interested in supporting teachers to teach about religion, but nothing will get done unless it shows up in the C3. So I thought about that for a while. I talked to John and Seth, and they said, actually, yeah, she's right. We should really try to make this happen. So perhaps because of our hubris, we took it upon ourselves to try to bring this to fruition. And it was because of the support of the Religious Freedom Center and Charles and Kristen and the Freedom Forum Institute president, who's here, Jean Policinski, that we were able to really take this project forward. And what that meant was we brought together a writing committee of teachers, of administrators, of subject matter experts in colleges and universities, of members of professional associations, and we said, what can we do to create something that looks like what's already in the C3 framework for the other fields and disciplines, which at the time were history, economics, civics, and geography, and anthropology, sociology, and psychology. Those were the 7 fields and disciplines in the C3 at the time. And we said, can we create a document that mirrors and format those, but really speaks to the unique multidisciplinary field of religious studies? And so over the course of a few months, we wrote that document, and then we sent it out to 32 different individuals and institutions. And that was really critical. That was something we learned from you, Charles, in your work on consensus statements, that if we're going to have this last, if we're going to be in communities and minimize the pushback that we get in communities and maximize the effect of the document, that we'd have to really bring in people from across the religious, political, and ideological spectrum. And so we had people from the Tannenbaum Center and from the Hindu American Foundation and from multiple colleges and universities, Rice University, Harvard University, from teachers in Connecticut and Texas and Illinois and Utah, who all came together and helped us revise that document, improve it. And then once we felt that we had a good product, we then sent it to the American Academy of Religion. As the largest learned society for scholars in the world who study religion, we wanted the AAR to take a look and to give us their perspective and then ultimately their official seal of approval. And only after we went through these multiple rounds of feedback, to reaching out to all the people in our networks, to hearing from the AAR, then we reached out to National Council for the Social Studies and Michael Simpson and Larry Pasca and some members of the board, including Stephanie Wager and Marianne Daniels. They all gave us feedback and helped us then take it to that next level, to have it actually included in the National Council for the Social Studies. So this was an incredibly collaborative document. It was something that was important to us to have multiple perspectives from within the education community, the religious studies community, different religious communities, civic society, civil organizations. And that's really what made the document strong. And luckily, we were able to build on the work that you've done and that the AAR did. In 2010, they had released a religious studies guidelines. They called Guidelines for Teaching About Religion in the K-12 Public Schools. That was released in 2010 by the AAR. And it was in drawing on that document, on the documents that Charles had produced, on some of the work of all the people on this panel, that we were able to create a document that said it is constitutional to teach about religion. NCSS itself had affirmed that a number of years prior, that it was important to teach about religion. And finally, here are some guidelines for how to teach about religion in K-12 schools.
Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you for your leadership on this. He looks young, but he's already a veteran in this field. The book that we've been talking about, to circle back to that, has the C3 document in it on religious studies. It has the AAR guide. It has one of our consensus guides, a teacher's guide to religion in the public schools, which kind of is a Q&A of the basic things you need to know under the First Amendment to get this right. So that's another thing about this book that's so valuable. It's like a one-stop handbook, right, that a district can have. If I could wave a wand, I think every district should have one in the central office, but every social studies coordinator should have this, because this is really the definitive guide, as Ben is suggesting, reviewed, vetted by people across the political and religious spectrum and the academic world. It just doesn't get any better than that, in my view. I'm not trying to sell the book, although I am trying to sell the book. I mean, I'm not trying to sell the book. I'm trying to say that all of this work should not stay on a shelf. It needs to be used. And so we need to find ways to get it to all the school districts in America so that they can do this. Kristen, last but not least on this round, and then I also want to get the audience in, so be thinking what you want to say and ask. So I'm going to ask you, because all of this that we're talking about is important and interesting academically and pedagogically, but what about the big question that I think many people have, many parents have, many Americans have? Is this just going to cause disruption, division? I mean, when people hear about more teaching about all these different religions, isn't that sort of a recipe for conflict and debate? And how do we have students engage this without getting angry at one another? They come from very different backgrounds and so forth and so on. So what is the most important advice you would give to schools when they are thinking about, we're going to up our game and do more religious studies, we're going to really let students talk about their religious views in the classroom and so forth and so on? What do they need to think about in terms of how they do this?
Two things come to mind. First is you really need to have the entire community part of this. I think it's important not only to have eventually, and it takes time, but we've learned a lot of lessons from our work in Georgia. You need to have the school board engaged. You need to have the superintendent to be an advocate and to say this is important. You need to have the administrators say, we are going to give you time for professional development because it's really important to do this. We need to have key teachers who are saying, we're going to take this on. We're going to make this happen. We're going to support our fellow teachers and support them in this. We need to have the students engaged as well. We also, though, need to have the parents, and we've alluded to this, how important it is, because it's often the parents who are fearful. And so they need to be part of the conversation, not left out or brought in at the end, but be there at the beginning. We also can't forget the religious leaders, because again, it's also the religious leaders who can often get upset, why is this being taught? And I can tell you, as an Episcopal priest who's also done a lot of PD work in public schools and been an administrator and teacher in independent schools, religious leaders are not taught how to do this, how to navigate the difference between teaching confessionally and teaching academically. And so if you're inviting a guest into the classroom in a public school, you need to make sure that there are guidelines for the religious leaders to understand how to do that. And also, to be very clear, as Donna said before, you're not speaking for your whole faith tradition. There is no way you can possibly do that. And students need to be able to see that this is one voice out of thousands or millions of perspectives. So that's one thing. It's a community. It takes a community to really transform. If that's what we're looking for, transformation of how this is done, it's going to take everyone. But that's going to take time to get it done, to get it to that level, but you have to be intentional and you have to have people who are willing to do that and be very strategic about it. The other piece, and going to civil dialogue, which I think is a really important part of this, is you need knowledge. Absolutely. You need to understand the constitutional, you need to be constitutionally literate. You need to understand what religious freedom is, what religious liberty looks like in the school district. You need to be religiously literate, as we've spoken about. But we also have to be very aware that these issues bring up controversy. And there are actually skills that can be taught, brought into the classroom, give students and teachers the skills on how to engage in dialogue to navigate these difficult issues. And part of the work that we've done at the Religious Freedom Center is to train leaders in all three of these competencies. That of course we need the knowledge, but we also need the skills to be able to engage with each other and learn how to respect one another when there is controversy in the classroom. And we've heard over and over and over from teachers. In Georgia, we've done, as you know, we've done a great deal of work who have said, I've been teaching in the classroom for 20 years, and this is the first year that I feel completely ill-equipped to deal with the controversies that are coming up in the classroom. So again, we need knowledge, but we also need skills. We need to make sure that our students are able to engage with one another and realize that not everything is a zero-sum game, that there's complexity here, and that we need to embrace the complexity and understand the complexity of these issues that we're dealing with.
Some school districts have actually asked you to come in and do civil dialogue training because they think that we can't do this other unless we have that. And so when you do that, are you engaging teachers to learn how to teach their students civil dialogue? Is that how you do it? You work with the teachers and then they work with the students? Or do you work with the students yourself?
I've done both, but more recently it's been working with teachers and teachers to use the skills not only to bring it into the classroom, but also to bring it to the faculty meetings, because teachers are saying, as faculty, we can't even figure out how to engage on these difficult issues and know how to move forward on them. And so they're bringing those skills. Yeah.
I've been to some faculty meetings that could use civil dialogue, that's for sure. So sort of an open-end question before I ask you for your questions, and that is for anybody to comment on, building on what Kristen just said. And the first part of your answer was really a wonderful way to think about what districts need to do, what we need to do in education. From your different perspectives, if you say, well, what do we need to do to make sure this really works and this really grows and this happens? And the reason I'm asking this question is because I've been doing this for a very long time. And I've seen bursts, right, of energy and change and new curriculum, and then I've seen it go away. Right? I've trained a lot of teachers, and then they retire. Now, we didn't have a lot of online resources today, and we have more online resources. Thanks to Kristen's leadership, we have professional development that you can do online on these. So we have new tools, but even so, I have seen these things come and go in education. In the 70s, there was a great explosion of interest in teaching about religion in the schools. Did you know that Pennsylvania had a statewide elective on religious literature of the West that was taught across the state, and they were going to do religious literature of the East, and then it kind of died out before they got there. Florida had a statewide world religions initiative where many schools taught world religions for a time. If you didn't know about this, it's because it went away. It was this burst after the Supreme Court decision about prayer and Bible reading. Oh, we can teach about religion, so let's do it. So that's why I'm asking this question of our panelists, because I've seen these bursts and then it goes away. Now, this has been a long bubble here, 1980s to today, so maybe we're really seeing the change that's going forward, or we're seeing a plateau. Okay, we now mention religion more often, good for us. It's in the standards, great, check that box. We mention Martin Luther King was a minister now, that's good, that's a mention. But we're not going to do any more. So my question to you, that's a long introduction to my question, but I just want to give the audience a context for why I'm asking this. How can we make sure this really grows and works? And you know, what is your best advice or vision for that? And anybody can jump in on this. Yes, Susan, you want to start? Yeah.
Well, there's skills, as Kristen mentioned, but then there's knowledge. And perhaps some of you are teachers here. I know one who's Chris Murray, who's done a whole lot of work on this. Imagine yourself standing in front of either a 6th grade or a 9th, 10th grade, world history class or world geography class or Eastern Hemisphere, Western Hemisphere, and you're called upon to teach about, the 5 major faiths, which some religious studies scholars call the Fab Five. There are many others, of course, too. So, and not only that, but you're in a big urban school where you probably have, among the different sections that you teach, a representative or 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 of each of these world faiths, who are students who may or may not know much about their own religion outside the normative, weekend school, Sunday school, sort of community teaching. You need knowledge, not just permission. And so one of the biggest things that has helped this bubble is first of all, having the guidelines upon which you can build content about each world religion. And a set of standards, a yardstick that says, no, this is not enough. Because actually for years, the gold standard for teaching about a world religion was Western European Christianity, because it's thoroughly embedded in the Western Civ European history curriculum. And as we added others, we couldn't just do so in a token manner. We needed to also respect their institutional development, change over time. One of the biggest problems that the AAR guide addresses is the idea that, well, this religion emerged 2,000 or 3,000 or some years ago, and that's how come all those people today are like that, and it's very static. So the real progress has been in putting down materials modeled on the guidelines for teaching about religion, with authentic teaching embedded within history, embedded within geography, and differentiated across the faiths, so that students don't just feel, well, this one has the full menu of institutional and change over time and so on, where those kind of just don't have it. If they don't learn about it, they assume it doesn't exist. And so that gets into the real equity issue and understanding issue. So there's been a huge amount of progress, especially with these things being available free online. The Pluralism Project, NEH has been very supportive, so many institutions that have now produced things that teachers can just access free online. And I must mention also the museums that now have, art right out there for you, to stream into the classroom on your big smartboard.
Yeah, one of the great things in the Georgia project that I loved recently, I was down there at the Carlos Museum at Emory for an institute with teachers learning how to use the art in the museum to enrich their teaching in their history course about religion. Wonderful idea. So there's this partnership between the museum and the public schools, which Akron Museum in Chapel Hill has done something like this over the years. So there are so many ways in which we can help teachers to enrich what they're teaching by linking them with institutions like that. So other ideas, thoughts. Ben, you want to go, and then I'll go to Donna, or vice versa, it doesn't matter.
Sure. Do you want to go first?
You go.
Okay.
Donna, you go, and then Ben.
Great.
I'll piggyback on Susan. Getting the materials out there and in front of the teachers is important. The standards themselves aren't necessarily going to sustain the teaching of religion, but the assessment of those standards infused within the assessment of the content standards and the skills, I think, is something that can be strengthened. So one of the major shifts of the C3 framework is ensuring that we are assessing content along with skills. And so that has driven all of our work in GCPS. So when students take end-of-course assessments, they are reading excerpts from the Hadith, and in the questions they answer, they have to show that they know how to think like a historian and read and analyze, and also understand the history they were taught in that course. So they're being assessed on skills and content at the same time. And so when you have these religion standards along with our content standards and the skill standards from the C3 framework, when we create assessments, we need to be mindful of how those can also play a role in what we hold the teachers accountable for teaching and the students accountable for knowing. So a real practical policy piece, education policy piece, I think, is making sure that our assessment practices follow our teaching and learning practices.
Great. Thank you, Donna. Ben?
So this is to piggyback off of what Donna said earlier about teacher preparation. I think every single person on this stage, in one way or another at a different time, has been involved with teacher institutes or workshops, training teachers to teach about religion. We're running a 3-day institute this summer. We ran one last year with NCSS. I know Chris Murray runs an institute for educators who are in service. Many of those focus on in-service educators. You just came back from New York from an in-service educator teacher institute. To me, a lot of those are absolutely critical. They're necessary, but insufficient. They feel a little bit more like Band-Aids, and that what we really need is to get at the source, which is pre-service teacher training. And if teacher institutions across the country actually trained social studies educators, future social studies educators, to learn what it means to teach about religion, whether they're teaching a standalone course or a US history or world history or other course, we have a better chance of institutionalizing religious literacy education across the country. So that's, I think, the real leverage point is we need to continue to offer these in-service trainings, but what can we do across our different sectors or our different angles, the different approaches that we take to this work, whether as teachers, administrators, subject matter experts, people in universities or in professional associations or in religious communities, to encourage teacher training institutions to take this very seriously. And right now, having it in the C3 is very helpful because we can go to them and say, the main professional society for social studies educators says we should be doing this. Are you training people to actually do this? I think now we have something that we can go to teacher institutions with, but that's the next frontier.
Yeah, and I just to add to that, I've tried to make the argument for years to no avail, but we'll keep making it, that anyone who's going to teach in the social studies, in my opinion, should have at least one religious studies course before they do it. I mean, because after that it's catch up. And religious studies is a discipline in and of itself, but teacher education is very crowded. It's very difficult to get changes in what is required of teachers. And maybe I should amend that and say, particularly for the older secondary school teachers, but I wish every teacher who taught social studies would have some religious studies background, would help so much, because religious studies is such a big part of every course, really, in the social studies. And you might say, well, not economics, but it should be. We talk a lot about history, but if you teach economics through just one lens, it teaches people just one understanding of the human and leaves out all the different perspectives of the many different religious perspectives on the meaning of work, altruism, and calling, and so forth. None of that is in the economics textbooks. There are no religious perspectives taught. So naturally, students, when they take economics, they have a very materialistic and very narrow view of the human and what it means to understand economics, because there's no exposure. I'm not asking for chapters and chapters. I'm just asking for some exposure. So the social studies, all the social studies courses, and literature, and art history, and any of the other courses, this should be across the curriculum question. So I'm just seconding what Ben is saying. Teacher education needs to take a step back and say, in one of the most religiously diverse societies in the world, the United States, in a world where religion matters, for better and for worse, across the world, deeply, most people in the world today, this is what matters. And what are we doing in preparing teachers to prepare students to live in such a world? And the answer is very, very little or nothing. So yes, it's a Band-Aid to do these workshops, but it's a good one, it's an important one, we'll keep doing it. But we need to get this bigger picture in. Emil, you want to get in on this, I'm sure.
So Charles, I remember we had a conversation when I was thinking about what type of research to do about Modesto, what to focus on, what would persuade administrators and superintendents about adding religion. And you were very blunt, and you said, well, show them that it improves test scores. I'm not sure that we can do that, right? I can't do it. I haven't been able to do it. But I think something which is closely somewhat related, and related to a point that you made, and something that we heard from superintendents and administrators in Georgia, is show that there's some sort of economic relation or some sort of economic value to teaching about religion. And we heard from religious leaders, civic leaders, but also most importantly from administrators in Georgia, that teaching about religion could be part of that puzzle because it's an increasingly religiously diverse workplace that students are going to, and they're participating in an increasingly global economy. And we heard this even from administrators in rural small-town Georgia who said, you know what, we have a lot of students here who were born here, they're going to school here, but they're not going to stay here. There's an Air Force base nearby, they're going to go there. So if you can make that sort of argument, I think that would be particularly persuasive. I would just add one sort of piece of advice and piece of caution to this debate. I think, and this, my experience in Georgia and my discussions in Georgia have really confirmed this for me. I think we have to be careful about avoiding a one-size-fits-all approach. I think the way that educating about religion, let's say in the Atlanta metropolitan area in Georgia, has to look a lot different than it's going to look, let's say, in rural small-town Georgia, which is one of the districts where the Georgia 3Rs was piloted. And I think so that there needs to be some caution and care taken with, being on the ground, listening to what administrators in different areas want in general and want out of teaching about religion, and then being sort of nimble and adaptable in formulating a program which is consistent with those needs.
Great. I'm going to get the audience in before we run out of time. If you have questions you'd like to ask, and I don't want to neglect you. Yes. Tell me who you are.
Hi, my name is Shamik Kabir. I'm a student at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm currently interning with the Indo-American Foundation. And I had a question for Emil. You mentioned that this class about world religions made the students more religiously tolerant. While that makes complete sense, I was curious about your methodology and the survey techniques that you use to empirically measure this.
Yeah, so we had, we had a survey tool which was about 100 questions long. We surveyed, dependent on different, different groups and different times, somewhere around 350 to 400 students. And again, we did it before they took the course and after they took the course. And we used some of the standard questions in the political science and tolerance literature. There's a lot, I can talk to you about this afterwards, there's a lot of great tolerance literature out there. And we use some of those standard questions again. Would you be willing to grant rights and liberties to members of your least like group, which is a really standard and very powerful question. We ask questions about, would you be willing to give all religious groups in your school the right to wear certain types of religious symbols outside of their clothing? Would you allow books from different religions to be put in, the school libraries and things like that? And again, consistently, we got not only we got statistically significant results on several dimensions when we applied that survey. Yeah. It's a great question. Thank you.
Yep, and your study is on our site, our website, the Modesto study, so people can also go and see that and see some of how you did it. Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that good question. Yes.
Rachel Heck, former school librarian. Okay. You've mentioned pushback, parental pushback, and also community pushback. Pragmatically, what are the different forms of action that pushback takes? And importantly, what do you say to the individual teacher or school principal about how to address or handle the pushback that has been made?
That's an excellent question. Want to comment on that?
Sure, I have a lot of stories so we could tell about different examples of pushback. A lot of times it takes the form of a parent email after the guest speaker or after the field trip to be proactive, and I think Kristen named this well. To be proactive, we encourage teachers to reach out ahead of time about whatever it is that they're about to study, and not just about religion, but that's one of our best practices we encourage. We actually have letters for parents to engage the parents and relatives that we encourage teachers to use at the beginning of every unit of study. But if that hasn't happened, or if there is still that pushback, we oftentimes, or the teacher will get an email or the principal will get an email. And if it gets forwarded up to us, we're asked to provide support for what the teacher is, the situation, whether it's the guest speaker or just the teaching of the topic in general. So one of our first stances is, what did the teacher teach? What text did they use? What were the circumstances? And is it in the curriculum? So we can stand behind anything that's in the curriculum. Any text that the teacher used to interact with the students, we would completely stand behind that. We had a teacher who took students on a field trip to a mosque, and a parent was upset that the student had to remove their shoes, and said that violated her rights, her First Amendment rights. And so we got a very long email threatening litigation and all kinds of things like that. And so the principal sent it to us right away and said, how can you help us with that? Part of it was in the curriculum, we did not mandate that people take the field trips, but we gave guidance and suggestions if they wanted to make that option. And so we kind of worked with the school to see what the teacher had done leading up to the field trip, what message and permissions had gone home prior to the field trip, just to make sure that legally we were not out of compliance with anyone's legal or constitutional rights. And then we crafted a very carefully worded email about why we believe it's important to teach about religion, about the lessons and texts that the students engaged in leading up to that field trip, about how well prepared we felt that the students were to make that trip, and also, what the teacher did afterwards, to debrief that experience with the students and to situate it in the context with which they are learning it. So we felt very confident in supporting the teacher and the school in that regard with that parent. But that also gave us notice as a district that we need to continue to support the teachers and to message best practices around not just teaching religion, but doing even the more dynamic things like bringing in the guest speakers. But it also kind of brings back the point of if we can engage the parents and community ahead of time, that might also alleviate some of that pushback.
Yeah, and I want to add to what Donna is saying, because it's such an important question, because we've had a long history, as I think everyone knows, of conflict over how you deal with religion in schools. And so many people carry that history around with them. Many parents have that history in their heads. On one side, they may think, well, historically, we've been hurt by imposition of religion, and now we see it coming back. What does that mean? So there are those parents, and then there are those parents who feel like, well, public schools are hostile to my religion, and anything that they do, they question. And particularly with teaching about religions that they are unsure about or even don't like. So, you know, the worst, and I've had to negotiate over my career many of these conflicts in a local community, so I have, you know, a lot of scars to show that this is very difficult in the community, very painful, and sometimes goes on for a very long time if you don't get somebody to come in and help mediate. That's really too late, right? So the worst call one can get, my colleague Buzz Thomas is a wonderful religious liberty lawyer, used to say, you know, he'd tell the administrators we would train, he'd say, the call I don't want to get is, hey Buzz, I just did such and such. Did I do it right? He said, Buzz said, the time to buy the fire truck is before the fire, right? You don't want to wait until there's some explosion or some crisis. Sadly, many school districts, I mean, Donna is describing a school district that's kind of getting out ahead, understands how to get some parental involvement ahead of time. That's the right way to do it. But many school districts don't get out ahead. It's only when a crisis erupts, you know, about creationism in the science classroom or, you know, the prayer at graduation, the crisis erupts. Or in the curriculum, teaching about Islam is now a controversy in many places. Then they say, oh, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And then there's this overreaction on one way or the other. Well, we'll just get rid of it. Or, you know, tell the parent, I'm sorry, you're wrong, even though the teacher might have done something inappropriate in teaching about religion. It happens. A lot of teachers are not sure, and so they do exercises that sometimes are wrong, or are not appropriate. My point is, getting ahead of that means that a school district has to have sound policies that the school board has approved that do talk about how you deal with religion. And a lot of school boards say, oh, if we do that, there'll be a lot of controversy. No, actually, it's the other way around. If you don't do that, there'll be a lot of controversy, and you won't be prepared. In my view, school districts that have these good policies, not only are they prepared and have fewer conflicts, and when a conflict comes up, they know what to do, but in litigation, if it comes to that, they are going to win because they have prepared, this is what we're doing and why. If you don't have a policy, then you're open to all kinds of problems, including, sadly, litigation. So getting out ahead is very important, policies, and then preparing teachers. And I like this whole idea Donna's talking about, you know, helping teachers understand when it comes to teaching about religion, sometimes you have to go a little extra mile. Maybe you want to have parents opt in to a field trip, not just opt out. There's a difference. A lot of parents kind of hear about it afterwards and say, whoa, you know, no, let them opt in, and if they don't, then they don't, the students don't have to participate in it. So there are all kinds of ways in which you can prepare your district or your school to be proactive, to be ready. Most important, when creating these policies and guidelines and so forth and so on, have the parent at the table. Some of the parents from the community at the table. Have a student or so at the table. Have some of the religious leaders at the table. Have some of the local religious studies scholars. In other words, a school district that forms that kind of group to build the policy is really in great shape. Richardson, Texas did this, had a wonderful religious freedom task force, they call it, I think, and they created a policy for the district, and they had, you know, an atheist, they had an evangelical minister, they had parents, and at the end of this policy, which they all agreed to, they had people who could go back to these different communities and say, this is good, we support it. And they kept the task force going because when a controversy arose, they could take it to the task force and the community and say, can you help us in your own community over here? And so Richardson, Texas was proactive. And that's really what every school district needs to do to address what you're talking about. And then there are going to be controversies no matter what you do. But the question is, are you prepared? Do you have the resources? Do you have policies? If you have all that, you can deal with the controversy without probably any litigation or conflict. Yes, Susan.
Well, we're here in the museum,
Yes.
and I think there's a place for educating journalists about the lay of the land in these issues, because what we've seen in the coverage of standards is that there's a greater tendency to cover the explosion and the fire than there is to lay out the groundwork to say, well, here's the situation. And one of the studies that was done, it's published by the First Amendment Center, that I did after working with Warren Nord, was to see what the state standards now say about it. So from 1995 to the early 2000s, the states were promulgating their standards. And we found that every single state that had content-specific standards about history and so on mandated teaching about religion. They may or may not have tested it, but they mandated it. And you never hear about that in media coverage. You only hear about, oh, it's a controversy, and we thought God had been expelled from the classroom. You can't say the word. So understanding that this is not just required, so that teachers need to be put in some sort of comfort zone, because they're often not backed up either by administrators who may not be aware of the guidelines, who may not be aware of these requirements. And so when those controversies come up, they kind of don't know where to go. So I think it's very important that the media lay out, the groundwork for what are teachers required to do, so they're not between a rock and a hard place, or librarians between a rock and a hard place.
Thank you, Susan. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Mohammed Bashar Arafat, Imam in the Baltimore, Washington area. I was really happy to hear Kristen talking about that the religious leaders are not taught how to teach confessionally versus academically. And this is something I have to learn myself here in this country when I started doing programs for the State Department, working with cultural exchange students coming from 60 countries, and they have issues while they are living with host families. And then I found myself as somebody who had a contract with the State Department to provide counseling on religious issues for those students living with host families in 50 states. How to counsel them, but not as an imam in the mosque, as somebody who is giving them counseling, living with Christian families or families who have to begin with some issues about Islam and hosting a terrorist in their house, as the neighbors are telling them. But that led me to create programs for clergy, for imams from other countries, and now they come to us almost every year. Several embassies send them to the United States, and we bring them to Georgetown, to Susan. But hearing this from you, my question to you, I have seen the same thing. Now, not only the imams, but also priests and rabbis, also we're not taught about other religions. Are you doing this kind of training here for clergy in the United States and clergy from overseas?
We are, absolutely, and we'd be more than happy to talk with you and work with your group and any of your colleagues. I think probably most religious leaders that you talk to in the United States don't know the difference and haven't been taught the difference. I went to Yale Divinity School. I never learned about the First Amendment in all of my training there. I know many of my colleagues didn't, and yet, then you find yourself in a community and engaged in these issues. And so as religious leaders, we feel at the center here, and we've developed workshops and trainings to help religious leaders navigate these issues. And so, yes, we'd love to work with you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to add to that, Benny?
You have this coming week the conference with the Council of Islamic Schools in North America, in a couple of weeks, holding a conference, because these guidelines apply equally to teaching about other religions in religious schools. So it's happening on both fronts.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we work with educators, including religious leaders in private or religiously affiliated schools. So as Susan alluded to, in a week and a half, we'll be hosting a group of educators in conjunction with the Council of Islamic Schools in North America, the Sacred Heart School Network, the National Catholic Education Association, and the Thales Academy, training independent school teachers what guidelines are for teaching about religion in independent schools. But more broadly, we've been doing work in another track within the Religious Freedom Center, our Religious and Civic Leaders track, to work with religious and civic leaders who have not received the training to talk about religion and First Amendment freedoms with their parishes or congregations or religious communities. And we want them to feel comfortable with that knowledge so that they're able to then be, we call it train the trainer sessions, right? So these are people who work with their communities to train them in various different kinds of engagement, and we want them to feel ready to help their communities understand what it means to talk about religion in their own community, how that might be distinct from when they're talking about religion as teachers. As we know, a lot of religious leaders and religious community members end up being teachers in schools. They are government employees. They are people who are working with the public through museums or libraries, and so we want them to feel comfortable. So as Kristen mentioned, we'd be happy to have a conversation with you about the different kinds of opportunities that we have for not just educators, as we're talking about today, but also religious and civic leaders.
And I just want to add thank you for what you're doing. What a
really
wonderful
important.
work, and good for the State Department for having somebody attentive to that part of the lives of the students who come. I actually speak to a lot of those students here when they come through, you know, and I have thought about that. What is it like for them in Ohio or someplace, you know, and they come from another culture, another religious tradition? What is it like? And so I'm very happy to hear that there are resources for them, you know, when they deal with that. So thank you for that wonderful work. Other questions, comments? Chris, do you want to say something about what it's like to be a teacher doing this before we end this thing here? Because you've been doing this for some time, and you also do institutes for other teachers, and you have a chapter in the book. So we should hear something from what your experience has been, and you might want to address it in terms of what you think needs to be done, or anything else you want to say.
Sure. Well, hello, everyone. So I think the first thing.
Yeah, why don't you do that? That's right. Well, you go to the podium, and
Thank you.
you may not ever get him away from it if you say it.
I'll keep it brief. Well, thank you very much. I think, so my journey in the classroom as a public school teacher, teaching about religions, really starts with this panel up here. I was very nervous when I first started teaching a class in Montgomery County Public Schools, but there's so many wonderful resources out there, like the Hindu American Foundation in the back there as well. So I think that the key to being a teacher and teaching about religions is to reach out, use your email to connect, and use the trainings that these institutions have, and then also get this book.
Yeah, and what are some of the major issues you find in the classroom itself with your students when now you have been teaching, you taught world religions in Montgomery County, so it was all about religions. And any hurdles or challenges you want to mention? You don't have to, I know there are probably a lot to say, but that are particularly important for people to know?
I was pretty fortunate and lucky. So teaching in Montgomery County and teaching at the specific school I was at was really I didn't have to convince people that learning about religions was dangerous. It was more of an opportunity for their students. It was an opt-in course, so they took it as an elective, which I think helps with that. The students knew and the parents knew what they were getting into when it came to learning about religions. But I think as a teacher, making sure that you know that you're not an expert, that you tell the students up front about that, using these guidelines and coming back to them time and time again, and then also reaching out. So I've reached out to you and Kristen and Ben and Susan numerous times when questions come up in the classroom, and just telling them that you don't have an answer, but you'll look into it, and then you can come back. And I think that kind of staying ahead of it, like you said, try to stay ahead of it and pretend not to be an expert on all the religions.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Chris. Yes, one more question. I think we have time. Yeah.
I'm Rebecca Cooper. I teach religion in middle school, actually, at an Episcopal school in Alexandria.
Oh, okay.
And I guess I've been thinking a lot about age at which we do this work, because I'm a passionate middle school educator. I love middle schoolers. And I may be in recovery this summer after a crazy year, but I wouldn't want to spend my days with anyone else. And I'm fortunate to be able to teach religion as my subject, and I've taught religions of the world for many years, primarily from a mainly academic perspective within the classroom. And I guess I always find in the literature it's such an exciting time to be teaching this subject, because there is such a volume of increase in material. It's almost overwhelming to figure out what I'm going to use in the classroom and bring to my students. And I think the thing that touches me the most is when I read stories about teacher bias or stories about the bullying that's happening around issues of religion, which is why I think middle school is the age at which we need, I mean, I know elementary school is also a place, but I think people are more resistant in the younger grades to do that. I think so much emphasis is on high school and history in high school, which is wonderful, but I just, as a middle school educator, I always feel like we get left out sometimes of the conversation because that's where issues of identity are at the forefront and where they're so malleable and still such sponges. So I guess I would say in our work as we move forward, just to be sure that we're doing all we can to reach the breadth. And I don't know, I've read the C3 framework, I've read through all of the, I'm a private school educator, but I read all of the public school work. If you've sort of where that frame, I think the framework is primarily for high school students, or I'm just wondering how the framework fits across the grades.
That's a good question. Yeah, very good question. Yeah, what do you say, Ben?
Yeah, so that was the first question that we got after publishing the document. We had a number of people say, this is a great resource, but what about younger grade levels? So what we did is we did regather a writing committee, and it included more elementary and middle school educators. And we created, there's 14 learning objectives that are part of the C3. So we took all those 14 learning objectives, which in the C3 are written for grades 9 to 12, and we created grade bands for K, 2, 3, 5, and 6, 8. So that document exists. It's something that we haven't publicized as much. It's still going through, it's a sort of a longer process to get approval from the AAR. But that's something that we can send out to educators and we can share with you. But it is a great question. It's difficult to know how to teach about religion sometimes in those younger grade levels. There are not only fewer guidelines, but also fewer curricular resources in textbooks or collections of texts or books that you can read with young people, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's just a little bit harder to find. So that's something that we're working on at the center, is how do we create more resources so that teachers at those younger grade levels can feel more comfortable.
Well, you know what the irony of your question is? One of the ironies of your question? Mm-hmm. Yeah. In California, most teaching about religions occurs in 6th and 7th grade. Yeah, because California some years ago, and it hasn't been replicated in everywhere else. Arizona has a similar, and maybe some others, where they broke up history and wanted to dive deep. And in doing so, then they had to break it up in terms of grade levels. So they take U.S. history chronologically in different ages, which meant that world civilizations kind of fell in the 6th, 7th grade. Well, that's pretty challenging, because that's when they're learning about Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam and Christianity then. And so really speaking, what you're talking about is critical for California educators because they are the middle school teachers who are carrying the heaviest load, if you will, of teaching about religions. So that's one of the ironies, is that we need to speak to that because that's the reality on the ground for many teachers in the country. The other interesting thing to say is that, we need to think of this as a K-12 issue and just keep saying that to ourselves and remind ourselves that it is, because if we don't do this in the earliest grades and the middle grades, we're not going to get it right in the secondary grades. By that time, if we haven't had the foundation or the framework, if when you're studying about your neighborhood or your community as little kids, but you don't really learn anything about the religious institution or buildings and practices in your community, you're not getting the building blocks of religious studies, in my view. So there are building blocks at each grade level. If we're really going to take this seriously, and again, I'm not taking religion seriously means it's not a religious argument for doing it, I hope you all understand. It's a civic argument, it's an educational argument, it's a First Amendment argument, it's a are we going to live with each other in the future argument. And that has now become, from my perspective, a more urgent question than it ever has been. World events tell us this. And the United States is at a very critical moment where our diversity including the religious diversity, which is one of the most difficult of the diversities to negotiate, frankly, if you look at the world, is such that we are not prepared. We're not prepared. And religious illiteracy has great cost in a society because the root of ignorance, a root of fear and hate is ignorance, intolerance. I mean, if people are not educated about one another in their neighborhoods or people that they see or build, if they're not, they are more prone to develop these issues that we have now with the surge in anti-Semitism in America, with Islamophobia, with various minority religious groups, Hindus and Sikhs, facing all kinds of issues well, that's only going to grow and grow and grow because, if we just say, oh, it's America, we're all going to get along. Not so. And if we've learned anything in recent years, it's that we're not so exceptional after all, right? We don't just sort of breeze through in freedom and democracy. It takes work. And the work of freedom and democracy in the United States, we have deeply neglected learning how to live with our deepest differences, in my opinion. We have neglected it at our peril. We are putting at risk this experiment in freedom, in this experiment in liberty of conscience for all people. That's a tremendous vision, and I still think, are one of the great examples in the world of learning to live with differences, with all of our problems and our challenges, but I think the future is at risk. And religious illiteracy is critical to making sure that future is one of freedom, of understanding, of respect for differences. Boy. And so our schools have to urgently address this, in my opinion, K-12, not just when they get older. Well, with that sermonette, I think I'll end. You've been very great. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your questions, and thank you people who've tuned in online, and mostly thank you to this great, great panel. Yes,
And
Ben.
we have some closing remarks also from
We do.
Larry.
We do. Thank you for telling me that, because otherwise I would have just cut Larry off at the legs, and he wouldn't have had his closing remarks. Thank you. And he would have said afterwards, what? Yes, I knew that, but I had forgotten in my fervor. I had forgotten in my bringing people to this issue. So please, Larry, we want to hear from you again. Yeah.
I want to thank you all so very much for this conversation today. And we talked a lot about the C3 framework, but for those of us that may be tuning in or don't really know what it's about, I just want to walk you through how what you experienced this afternoon is inquiry in action. This is the C3 framework in action. So all inquiry begins with a question. Our fundamental question in social studies is, how do we prepare students for college, career, and civic life? That's our fundamental question. So the next step in inquiry is you have to figure out what knowledge, what skills, what disciplines help us answer that question. What we learned today is why religious studies is vital to answering that question, why religious studies is fundamental to a well-rounded education. The third step in inquiry, though, is we gather sources and we use evidence to draw conclusions. So, like Charles, I'm not selling the book so much as just reinforcing that what you have and what I hope you've experienced today is you have thought leadership, you have research, you have policy guidance, you have decades of experience going into a publication that's attempting to help you answer that question in your community. Whether you are a classroom teacher, whether you are a scholar, a community member, a school board member, just asking the question, a superintendent making a tough decision about curriculum and instruction, we want you to be able to use resources like this book and the resources and the talent that are both on stage in the audience, as well as your talents in thinking about religious studies, to really help answer that question. And so I want to thank Ben, Susan, Emil, Donna, Kristen, Chris, for your writing, and all of the other writers for your voices that are here, because what you heard today, this wasn't a chapter by chapter description of the content. This is a summation of all of the thinking that goes into solving that question of how do we prepare students for college, career, and civic life. And the thought about the discipline of religious studies as a way to think of that question is what is here. And Charles, I want to thank you so much for your thought leadership, your vision, your editing of this volume, because this is, again, it is the start of the conversation, but we wanted this innovative dialogue, which, by the way, it's not often we do kind of a book launch in this way, but we wanted to do this because our thinking was, let's not just publish a really important book, let's actually have the conversation out in public space and start to talk it through. So the last part of inquiry is really on you and our audience and online viewing this today, and that is taking informed action. So that's the inquiry process. This is what C3 is about. What will you do now that you have a book, now that you know that there's a web of support around you from scholars and practitioners and policymakers? You have support if you want to have this conversation in your community. If you want to think of how do I start a course, how do I embed throughout my program, how do I bring my kids the questions and answers that they're looking for, how do I give them sources of information and really important discussion, you have support. Please trust the resources in the room. And if you would like to know more about this book, socialstudies.org. Please feel free to look up more information about the book. Some of our colleagues from NCSS are here today to share more with you about it. ReligiousFreedomCenter.org. Please visit them for more information about professional institutes as well that they offer. Again, a web of support is available to you, and we're proud of the partnership that we have. I do want to thank the Religious Freedom Center, the Freedom Forum Institute for providing the space, the museum today for allowing us to come in here and have this conversation with you. And we're just very excited at the possibilities of how this can help us answer that question of how do we prepare all students for college, career, and civic life. So thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for your participation today.
Thank you so much, Larry.